So good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad to introduce the second session of this conference, Maestro delle Nazioni, Tartini's influence and reception and dispersion of his work. The first speaker is Lucia Kofich. She is a research associate at the Department for History of Croatian Music of the Croatian Academy of Arts and Sciences in Zagreb. She graduated in musicology and in library science at the University of Zagreb and completed her PhD studies in 2017 at the Universität für Musik und Darstellende Kunst in Graz. Research interests include Giuseppe Michele Stratico's criticism of music, the 18th century music theory, digitization of music materials, preservation and presentation of musical heritage, Croatian music culture in the late 19th and early 20th century, and research on musical archives. She will now present on Giuseppe Michele Stratico's theoretical thinking, transgressing, and boundaries of Tartini school. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction and greetings to everyone. I want also to thank the organizers for their invitation or acceptance of my presentation today. So, is this okay? So the work of Giuseppe Michele Stratico has been recently revalued, marking him as an interesting contributor to the musical and theoretical thought of the second half of the 18th century. Moreover, Patrizio Barbieri is in his new book, Quarrels on Harmonic Theories in the Venetian Enlightenment, published in 2020, states that he is one of the authors whose direct involvement in the harmonic debate at the time has so far been overlooked and undervalued. There aren't many details about Stratico's involvement in his school, but Tartini, in his letter in 1750 to the Count Francesco Algarotti, who at the time was in the service of King Frederick II, King of Prussia, writes: Ma ne ven questo è obietto, perché qui in Padova vi è un giovane dilettante mio scolare, si chiama Michele Stratico, ed è persona civile assai, che in mia mancanza potrebbe essere scelto maestro del giovane destinato. È certissimo che se ben nato tale non direbbe di no ad un tal monarca, ed è certissimo che nel suonare e comporre è famoso e distinto fra tutti i miei scolari, perché possiede l'anima intera della mia scuola. Tartini's school, widely known for its violin technique teaching, was also considered, as pointed out by Margherita Canale, as a school that educated a complete and conscious musician, in which Tartini's principle of the third sound, terzo suono, and his theoretical system in general had an important role. I tend to believe that the disagreement between the teacher and the student, either transgressing the boundaries of his teacher's school, led Stratico from the student who possesses the whole soul of his school to his declared enemy. At the beginning of my presentation, I would like to point out a quotation from Stratico's Lo Spirito Tartiniano, his imaginary dialogue with his teacher Tartini, from which one can find that Stratico considered that he and Tartini had the same base, but a different method of approach, that is at least at their starting positions. He puts these words in Tartini's mouth. Out of respect for the essential, this your summary is not lacking, it embraces it, although the exposition you make of the subjects recognize a style and method that is different from mine. But it doesn't matter, you have my thinking and that's enough. Each has its own method of reasoning. It's difficult to have a convenience in that. Common point to both theories is the tendency to defend the position of music as a science, which means to supply contemporary music with a theory based on natural, physical, or mathematical laws. This was put to question particularly in the work of Antonio Eximeno, dell'origine delle regole della musica con la storia del suo progresso, decadenza e rinnovazione, published in Rome in 1774. stating that music does not have correlation with mathematics because all numbers and proportions related to music tones and intervals are altered related to nature, thus useless. He particularly criticized Euler, Tartini, and Rameau, dedicating 3 chapters to their theories and their rejection. Unlike Tartini, Stratico did not seek the physical fundament for his system. He returned to the mathematical basis without taking into account the scientific debates of the time about the validity of the founding of the musical system in one of the physical phenomena, vibration, sound, body, terza suono, etc. The physical basis of Tartini's system in the third sound. In his treatise, Tartini explained the phenomenon, gave the method how to calculate it, and understood it as the basis of the harmonic context. It is the fundamental base. Related to this, Stratico also rejected Rameau's phenomenon of the sounding string, considering that it doesn't cover the complete six-fold system and does not include the explanation of the modus of the minor third, on which he agreed with Tartini and Valotti. In addition, Stratico criticized Tartini that although he dismissed Rameau's phenomenon as incomplete, in his treatise he constantly returns to it. Although Stratico did not base his conclusions upon the third sound, we can still find the similarities of this concept with the proportional relationship on which Stratico relied upon. For example, the importance of the minimal differences that have a particularly important place in Stratico's system, such as the minimal difference of comma 180, 1 to 81, are sufficient to change the harmonic proportion of the major third into the arithmetic one. For Stratico, these two proportions give different oral effect. Lo sviluppo delle armoniche proporzioni ed aritmetiche dalle geometriche discrete si è fatto all'oggetto di rimarcare che nella comparazione sensibile dell'una all'altra distingue l'udito il carattere, ossia natura armonica, dall'aritmetica, fino a che giunge a rilevare la differenza recata dagli rispettivi proporzionali mezzi armonico ed aritmetico. In Tartini's system, considering the third sound, the minimal difference is sufficient to change the third sound. To demonstrate it, Tartini gave the example of the third sound of the major tone, 9 to 8, and the minor tone, 10 to 9, for which he concluded that one has to insist on their perfect intonation. The question of perfect intonation brings into focus the attitude about temperament of both authors. Tartini, in Trattato di Musica, pointed out that he supported Valotti's unequal temperament, in which were retained natural, perfect relation of the white keys of the organ, while black keys allowed greater imperfections. But aware of the practice, which in the second half of the 18th century was directed more towards equal temperament, Tartini was also willing to accept it. But on this issue, Stratico was unwilling to compromise. The system he developed was within the framework of just temperament and required also the possibility of adapting the pitch of the tone, thus making it possible only for a limited instrumental corpus, which is strings. For so-called mechanical musical instruments, like keyboard instruments, he encouraged the search for new solutions. You can see here in this example. However, in the context of answering to the scientific quality of music, he considered that for music as an applied science, certain imperfections tolerated by ear were allowed. Considering the precision of the tones and relations, Stratico particularly emphasized the importance of connecting notes, music symbol, and numbers, mathematical symbols, to determine in the most accurate way which tone or relation was considered. As opposed to Tartini, who was uncomfortable in using fractions relating to harmonic series, Stratico had no problem whatsoever with them. One of the bases of Stratico's system was the extension of the base from the six-fold system, sestupla, to the eight-fold system, ottupla. We can find a direct impetus for this in Tartini's constant questioning of the limits of sestupla and an inability to give strong reasons for exclusion of the term 1/7 from the system. For Tartini, the reasons for exclusion were that the term 1/7 broke down the consonant system and turned it into dissonant, resulting from the geometric continuous proportion, and that from this term the harmonic system started and the diatonic ends. On the other hand, the naturally in tone minor 7, intervallo di facilissima intonazione sopra il violino ed evoluto dalla natura armonica, because of which the minor 7 has the privileged treatment in the practice, Tartini considered it consonant. Dunque una tal settima è consonante non dissonante. In dei principis, this statement was slightly softened. Fa di settima minore che è dissonanza talmente omogenea che si usa in pratica con privilegi affatto particolari, i quali se non la determinano consonanza positiva, certamente la singolarizzano mezzana tra le consonanze e le dissonanze. Tartini's not completely defined attitude towards the minor 7th was the reason for Stratico's criticism of his teacher, comparing his indecision with the story of a bird under a hat. I don't know if you are familiar with this story. It's about a man who meets an oracle who keeps, and he keeps a bird alive under the hat, and he asks the oracle if a bird is alive or not. And the answer is, it will be what you want to be. Stratico was a theorist who, without reservation, based on this Tartini's foundation, declared the natural minor 7th consonance and treated it accordingly in his system. There are several consequences of this attitude. One is to include the minor 7th in the scale, which Stratico actually did. As Tartini stated, perciò la sesquisesta nel diatonico sistema è un assurdo, perché la scala diatonica che consta di 8 termini verrebbe a costare di 9 termini se settima avesse luogo. Stratico emphasized in his treatise that only Tartini preceded him in this issue. Tartini introduced the minor 7th into the diatonic scale to solve several problems in the relationship of the scale and the fundamental bass when descending, but which Stratico rejected in his Lo Spirito Tartiniano. It is possible that Stratico was, as well as Tartini, impressed by the symmetry and the circular form of this construction. However, the introduction of the minor 7th into the scale provides also the proportional form of the scale, the lack of which was criticized by Eximeno. Tartini's extended scale and its corresponding bases correspond to Stratico's 9-tone scale, as well as their corresponding bases. You can see here part of Tartini's trattato, and manuscript is Stratico. Due to such origins of Stratico's thinking, we can pose the question whether any other among Tartini's pupils interested in music theory shared the same standpoints as Stratico. It is likely to predict Tartini's objections to such Stratico's admission of the minor 7th in the consonant system, and consequently the rejection of both such an attitude and system, because we can find his explanation at various points in his treatises, explaining why the 7th could not be the part of the consonant system. Si trova finalmente che il di più è bensì legittima conseguenza di questo antecedente, ma non necessaria, perché finalmente tutto il di più è bensì modo diverso di armonia, ma non è già sostanza diversa. Come sostanza è sempre la dedotta dalla sestupla senza che sia mai possibile né dimostrativamente né praticamente di alterarla. Dunque, con tutta ragione resta dimostrato e confermato nella sestupla il compimento e periodo del fisico armonico sistema. In my opinion, it is precisely this definition of the limits of the consonant system in the sestupla that Stratico wanted to question by developing his own system. In order to mark more accurately the tone represented by the 7th term of the harmonic series, Tartini introduced a new sign, which you can see here by the 7th, explaining also that the tone represented by 180 is lower than B flat 175 in relation of minor half tone semitono minore, 36 to 35. It was a possible impetus for Stratico to start thinking about introducing new signs into his system. For the term 1/7, Stratico used the sign and the difference between the tone 1 to 42 and the tone 1 to 45 he called semitono maggiore crescente in ragione 35 a 36. While Tartini used only one sign, Stratico developed a whole system of signs in accordance with his standpoint that particular relation between the tones should be marked more precisely in the notes. Almost an invitation to such a project by Stratico could be read in the following passage by Tartini. Se poi in pratica per evitare la confusione giova intendere il numero organico come si è inteso finora e giova veramente, si faccia senza scrupolo alcuno, molto più perché un tal difetto non procede intrinsecamente dal numero organico, quale per propria forza è sempre una pratica dimostrazione, ma procede dalla mancanza di un segno musicale che in quello e in altri casi dovrebbe aggiungersi di nuovo per dimostrare la individuale differenza di quei due termini, i quali se ben segnati con la stessa lettera musicale, nonostante sono fra loro diversi. There are several more issues important for Stratico that we can single out as based on or having at least an impetus in Tartini's thinking. The issue of the limitation of the harmonic series, the issue of the exclusion of the terms 1/11 and 1/13 from the diatonic scale, the issue of the absence of the arithmetic mean from the octaves from the fundamental tone of the harmonic series, and the origin of the minor mode. But it is too much for today's presentation. I will leave it for a paper version. To conclude, in Stratico's thinking, we can find a dose of courage and audacity to challenge his teacher's views, causing him to accept some new features beyond the common framework, which has led to the formation of his new musical theoretical system. It was, in my opinion, the perfect and the last moment for development of such a system, a moment in which experiments with sound were widely spread, challenged, and debated, and the equal temperament was not yet fully established. Stratico began reflecting on music theory under the influence of his teacher Tartini, but he offered different solutions to particular problems and issues already raised in Tartini's treatises. One possible reason was the predetermined nature of certain parts of Tartini's system, in which he wanted to do everything to maintain concepts such as, for example, the sestupla and the common diatonic scale. Although later forgotten, Stratico's theory can be considered really an interesting contribution to the harmonic theories of the 18th century in general. Thank you for your attention.
So many thanks for this very, very interesting contribution. Are there any questions? I will please you also to tell us something, or to you have this other option in the chat. Just to see, okay, I see here in the chat. Thanksgiving. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
Can I
please.
ask? Yes, I want to know if there are manuscripts or things of the found of the legacy of Stratico in the Croatians archives or founds or something like this.
No, not any. Not even music nor theory. He went to Padua at a very young age. And I have, for now, haven't found any proof of his connections with his family. and his brothers were all very active in Zadar as well as in Istria and Hvar. But no, I still don't have any proof that in Croatia he was even today, they often forget him as one of the brothers, Stratico. They take into consideration Simone, Domenico, and Gregorio.
And the others are also musicians or not?
No, no. They were, Simone was a scientist, very famous in naval construction. Domenico was a bishop, and Gregorio was an advocate. He was a lawyer.
Okay. Do you think that it's possible that you can find in some archives in Zadar some descriptions or something more, or you think that what you have now, it's all you can have?
I think that something can be found in Italy, not here, because Stratico himself mentions his nephews in communications of his writings. It's a very similar format that that mentions Tartini in recently in epistolary, in his letters, for which Barbieri indicates Stratico as a potential correspondent.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that Italian archives of his or legacy or of his nephews are more likely to find in Italy than in Croatia.
Okay, thank you.
So I see Lubowski. We cannot hear you.
Excuse me, Roberta. Thank you very much, Lucia, for the very interesting presentation. When Stratico was studying with Tartini in Padova, did he study some theoretical rudiments with some other people from Il Santo, like Caligari or Valotti or someone? Because the excerpt from his treatise you shown with the exclusion of nona and decima et decima from the system, it resembles very much Caligari and Valotti's approach to these dissonances.
Well, Caligari left only a couple of years later, because I wrote in your in the second contribution to Barocco Padano that Stratico arrived in 1734.
Ah,
yes,
and
but
Caligari left already 2 years later.
But Valotti, yes, I overlooked when Stratico was in Padua. But with Valotti, maybe
he certainly studied Valotti, because there are excerpts for from Valotti's treatise in his hand in his notes, which is beside his treatises. His treatises are kept only, are preserved only as manuscripts with many variants and studies for it. And you can find their transcripts of Valotti's treatise as well. And in fact, mathematical basis of his thinking is in fact Valotti's influence and not Tartini's. And there is a letter that is also supposed to be Stratico's, written to Valotti, which then shows that he discussed some matters and disagreements with Tartini with Valotti.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Maybe I have a question, just following Bella's question, because now in this paper you talk about the relation also between Stratico and Eximeno. This was a very new element for me. But concerning Stratico and Valotti, if there is a transcription or the particle scripting from this only printed sources of Valotti, maybe this is a sign that there was no real close relationship between the Stratico and Valotti, because he had no access to manuscripts or to other sort of sources, maybe.
But do you suggest that in which
some letters as I read, and there is this partial transcription of his printed source, but for example we don't have evidence from manuscript sources of a closer relationship between the two of them. Just because your title here, you told us as okay, this is a Tartini school, but you don't explicitly mention this so-called Scuola Padovana or Scuola dei Rivolti. So I would like to know what is your position in this concern. Is there a Paduan school, or are you prefer to speak about Tartini school, etc.?
A similar question was in Padua a few years ago about Paduan school. I think we can talk about Paduan school, but not. But in relation with French Enlightenment, because it is a common circle, although they have disagreements.
Although in that case you have to exclude Caligari because he has no real connection to the French Enlightenment, for example, just for
he didn't read French even, yeah.
No, but in any case, he wanted no attempt, just made no attempt to found a known school or something like that.
But I'm convinced that Stratico started his reasoning within Tartines school and then looked for support in some other thinkers, like not only Valotti, but also possibly even Euler, and I don't have proof for that, but
maybe not D'Alembert, because today you introduced a new sign for the minor seventh, and we found in this article by D'Alembert in this whole polemic against Abamo and Tartini, etc. This French sign for this seventh degree.
This sign is also interesting because Valotti also has a new sign for this tone, and it's more similar to first version of Tartini's Tartini's sign. He has it. If you look closer to his versions of his treatise, he developed his sign system from what I consider earlier works to these are which are more elaborated, like in like preparation for publishing.
That's interesting because Valotti also in his Scienza Musicale mentioned in the preface this calculation polemic against D'Alembert. And that's about this encyclopedia article on Fundamental, where D'Alembert introduced our own sign for the seventh degree. So for me, it's just what you presented today, another part of a European dimension of this problem on this matter. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? So if there are no further questions, or maybe we can continue at another place, I would like to introduce the next speaker of this session. Mr. Juan Mariano Porta. Mr. Porta graduated in guitar, trombone, and music education at the Conservatory of Music in Mar del Plata in Argentina. He pursued further studies in composition at the Conservatory in Padua and completed the master's degree in music and performing arts at the University of Padua. He is currently a PhD candidate in the history of arts at the Ca' Foscari University in Venice. Porta is guitar professor at the acclaimed Music Academy of Abano Terme and at the Anton Iabelli Academy of Padua. He is involved in different projects concerning Giuseppe Tartini, creating a collection of Tartinian writing at the Music Conservatory of Trieste and a collection of all manuscripts and prints of Tartini at the University of Padua. Since 2019, he collaborates with the Tartini 2020 Association in Padua towards the publishing of Tartini's music. So the title of Porta's presentation is Tartini's three sonatas in the Berkeley collection. Please.
I thank all the organizers, Nate, Sergio Durante, Roberta Vidic for the presentation. I thank friends, colleagues, and listeners. I share the screen. Okay. And I start with the presentation. Okay. Giuseppe Tartini composed about 40 trio sonatas. According to Paul Breiner, in his 1969 catalog of Giuseppe Tartini's trio sonatas, the author compositional activity is mainly dated between 1745 and 1749. The result was with the publication of 5 prints between 1749 and 1756. It must also be said that about a fourth part of the Tartini's trio sonatas does not appear in the prints, and it is likely that this work were produced in the following years. The prints have not been authorized by the author, and from the comparison with the manuscript, some difference can be seen. In the musical phrasing, in the addition of the ciphers in the basso continuo, in some cases in the different structure of the sonata, modified through the addition and grouping, that is reordering of the movements. On the other hand, the manuscript repertoire continued to undergo changes within the Tartini cycle through the widening, correction, and grouping of the different preserved sonatas. Since the collection are not dated only through the analysis of the copies and to a lesser extent of the style, I was able to establish 4 different chronological moments of the corpus of the 3-part manuscripts by Giuseppe Tartini. These periods are represented in the 4 main manuscripts collection, all of Paduan origin. First, there are the following manuscripts of the Antoniana Library, manuscripts 1907, sonatas from 1 to 11, the manuscripts 1884 part 3 and 1896 part 11, that together make a single sonata. The copyist is Bartolomeo Stefanelli, hand of Berkeley, violinist and violist of the Basilica of St. Anthony, named Il Santo. From 1764 to 1774, the collection is characterized by sonatas in 2 movements with slow-fast succession, except for the sonata D2 in D minor, which consists in 3 movements in fast and slow-fast succession. Secondly, there is the manuscripts 951 of the National Library of Paris. The copyist is Giulio Meneghini, a student and successor of Tartini, active in the Santo from 1765 until the beginning of the 19th century. The collection includes 3 sonatas that have been modified from 2 slow-fast section movements to 3 fast, slow-fast section movements. Are the sonatas D2, D7, and C4. Thirdly, we find manuscripts from 809 to 823 of the University of Berkeley, California, written by Hand A, identified in the catalog of the collection of Italian manuscripts of the 17th century of Berkeley, and active in a period similar to that Giulio Meneghini. These manuscripts form part of the collection that belonged to Anton Bonaventura Sberti and was sold to the University of Berkeley in the 1950s. The complete collection counts a total of 670 works, in which there are 156 works by Tartini copied from Hand A. The collection 3-part works includes 6 slow fast section 2 movements work, 4 last slow fast 3 movements works in section, and 5 4 movement works that are the result of the unification of 2 movement sonatas already appearing in the previous sources or collections. Okay. Finally, we find the manuscript 19 seats of the Antoniana Library on an unknown hand, which includes almost of the non-trio sonatas of Tartini. A peculiarity of these collections all is that although some of them, such as manuscripts 1907 and manuscripts 951 of Paris refer to an earlier period, all were created starting from the 60s of the 18th century. In the case of Berkeley collection, it is interesting that the trio works are differentiated into 3 subgroups: Sonata 3, that's trio sonatas, trio, and Symphony A3, that's trio symphony. In the case of Sonata 3 subgroup, there are monotonal 2-movement sonatas, manuscripts between 811 and 815, or 3-movement manuscripts 809 and 810. These include the extension of the structure of the Sonata C1, manuscripts 810, by adding an initial allegro to the movements already present in the previous collections, as manuscript 1907 part 1. The later edition is characterized by the maintaining an homogeneous style with the rest of the sonata, which is characterized by the high percentage of consecutive third and sixth and imitations. For the entry trio, we find manuscript 816 with the Sonata F3, to which a final minuet was added in comparison with manuscripts of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde of Vienna. This manuscript of Paduan origin by Giulio Meneghini hand. For this wording trio, in this work, we only find a difference in the alternation between slow and fast movements in comparison with the Sonata 3 subgroup. We already look at slow, fast, fast in the trio and fast, slow, fast in the Sonata 3. That count 3 movements. This difference might not be decisive, which is why we can conclude that the difference might be a consequence of the terminological ambiguity of the period and the accurate copying by Hand A by Vienna manuscript, since this last one includes the word trio. Sorry. In the case of Symphony A3 subgroup, we have different types of works. 3 movement works with atonal contrast in the central movement, manuscripts 817 and 18, full movement works without tonal contrast, manuscripts 819, 20, and 23, that are the result of the union of two movement sonatas. Full movement works, the result of the union of 2 different works with an atypical tonal contrast not found in other works. A in the manuscript 821 and AG in the manuscript 822. The grouping operation done is manuscript from 819 to 823 was probably carried out with the aim of adapting all pieces to a new compositional paradigm or to a new executive context. The grouping finds elements of similarity in the last period of Tartini, who left us the autograph of the Sonata F1, which is characterized by the assembly of movements belonging to different sonatas in a structure of 4 movements. This grouping has a tonal contrast on the first movement that is set to its minor of the main tonality. This procedure grouping, however, must be done with care, since under no circumstances it is replicated equally in Berkeley manuscripts. In the case of the manuscripts 819, 20, and 23, the groupings retain the tonal unity without internal contrast. Whereas in the manuscript 821, Sonata A2, A5, and 822, Sonata A10, G4, we find groupings that do not respect the same tonality and do not show a coherent tonal plan, also presenting a large internal difference in style between the first 2 movements and the following movements. Agnese Pavanello, in reference to this fact, declared that the rather incongruous juxtaposition of some trios leaves doubts about the authority of the tradition represented. In fact, despite the collection belonging to the Tartini cycle, these reworkings could be the result of a different purpose of the works, compared to the original one, where the author's control was absent. The similarity in the phrasing of the Sonata F1 between the autograph and manuscripts 812 also confirms the proximity between the last period of Tartini and his collection. Regarding the style, beyond the general structure of the sonatas, a number of elements have been detected that allow to identify the predominant sound interweaving of each work, and through the analysis determine a characterizing profile of each of them. The analysis revealed 3 main elements which condition the results. These are consecutive thirds and sixths. They are characteristic of Corelli trio sonatas. Imitations, they are frequent at the beginning of some movements and also in divertimentos and progressions, and accompanied melody of the first violin usually. In addition, there are some phrases that, in comparison with the sources of the previous collections, are reworked and reproposed in unison in octave. These changes might have been made with the intention of varying a passage made of consecutive thirds, considered monotonous, or to obtain a greater intensity of the passage, especially if it was made with a reinforced instrumentation, as was often the case in the four-part symphonies of the period, for example. In the manuscripts, 109 Sonata C4, Movement 3, we can see the unison movement, and in this case, the bass is also transposed an octave higher. In the other case, we can see a movement to the unison. Okay. After highlighting the type or musical intervention of the work in the Sonata A3 subgroup, I found the following results. A high percentage of consecutive thirds and sixths, and a low percentage of accompanied melody with the presence of imitations in the oldest sonatas. Thus does appear in previous collections. So, manuscripts 809 and 810. A high percentage of accompanied melody and consecutive third and sixths without or with very few imitations in the manuscripts 811, 814, and 815. Sonatas D1, A6, A minor 1, and which a higher number of imitations in manuscripts 813, Sonata A4. Since this work appeared for the first time in the present collection, we can assume that the composition occurred in a late period, and therefore it could be legitimate to associate the predominant presence of the accompanied melody with the late works. Sorry. The fact that the Unicum manuscripts 814 Sonata A6 is the work with the highest percentage of accompanied melody would contribute to confirm this hypothesis. Is 76%. Okay. A balanced percentage between consecutive thirds, sets, and imitations with the inclusion of the accompanied melody. This is the manuscript's 812 Sonata F1. In this case, the composition could belong to a late period, but the compositional paradigm refers to charged sonatas. In the case of the trio, the values are similar to manuscripts 812 Sonata F1, with a balanced percentage between the different elements surveyed. For this reason, a chronological proximity in the composition should not be excluded. Finally, in the Symphony A3 subgroup were found the following results. A high percentage of consecutive thirds and sixths and a low percentage of accompanied melody with the presence of imitations in 2/3 of the cases. Manuscripts from 817 to 821, movements first and second, and manuscript 823, movements first and second, coinciding with the most dated works of the subgroup Sonata A3. So a very high percentage of accompanied melody without imitation in manuscripts 821, movement 3/4, Sonata A5. The words constitutes an exception given the fact that predominance of the accompanied melody is added to an early date. This date dates to the first compositional period of this repertoire, and Maupety's first print of 1749 constitutes proof. A high percentage of imitations and consecutive third and sixths with accompanied melody in manuscripts 822 first and second movement, and a high percentage of accompanied melody and third and sixth parallel in manuscripts 822 and 823, movements 3 and 4, sonatas G4 and A9. In this case, it is a subgroup already present in manuscripts 951 of Paris, in the press of Maupetit, 1749, characterized by the first short movement and a second movement of a pastoral character in 12 heights. Now the conclusions. The Symphony A3 subgroup date back to the first compositional period of the repertoire together with trio sonatas in 3 movements, sonatas C4, C1, and there. The grouping cycles of 4 movements of the Symphony A3 subgroup are a procedure that find its justification in the evolution of the repertoire within the Tartini circle, as Tartini himself used it for the F1 trio sonata. It must be highlighted, however, that no grouping in Berkeley collection is similar to the one made by the author, and that most probably the disproportionate groupings were made without Tartini's control, including after his death. Sonata 3 of 2 movements were most likely composed after the release of the print editions. That is, after 1755. For the style, there is a greater percentage of melody performed by the first violin, not accompanied by the other instruments. At the last, there are no unique elements that allow to differentiate the trio from the Sonata 3 subgroups, besides referring to the ambiguity of the terms. Okay, and the question mentioned about the performance practice remain on a speculative level. Thank you.
So many thanks for this exciting paper about an under-researched genre of music in many terms. There is a question of mine. You mentioned at the very end that many issues concerning performance practice are open. What about the performance practice of the bass line? Have you maybe some pieces of information about this issue?
Okay, I can assume that for each collection, it can have a different instrumentation on executive practice, but not in a short at the end. So it remains in a speculative contest, I think.
Because this is a collection, a quite large corpus in an age of transition. And you have different possibilities, for example, on the strings, Mannheimer Schule, or the matter of cembalo accompagnato in the different phases of K. Philippe Emanuel Bach, for example, pre-stages of Wiener classic. So it would be quite interesting just to know how can we deal also with the bass line here. But it was, of course, very interesting to know about, in this very differentiated way, to know about the upper voices. What's the development doing this year? Yeah, sorry.
If I understand the question correctly, I think that only collection brings to a determinate group or instrumentation, but it is only a speculation. For example, this collection brings to think that this an instrumentation reinforced, but I'm not sure really. I have not proof. It is uncertain.
At least as we had just simple lines for the bass line without any numberings in things, examples of yours. So are there any questions? So the session is open.
I'd like to ask something to Mariano. I am Gabriele Taschetti. Hello, everybody. And I am curious about one thing, the unison and octave passages that you showed us. How do you think that is this compositional feature relevant in Tartini's production?
Can you repeat, please?
Do you think that the unison or octave passages is some relevant feature into Tartini's sonatas?
Okay. I cannot exclude it, but in the case of groupings, a direct intervention by Tartini is unlikely. But despite that, given the fact that in the last period, Tartini has revised and simplified the concerts as for example, Agnese Pavanello said at the last conference in Padua, I can guess a common practice within the Tartini cycle, but I need to deep in the subject, but it is.
Thank you.
So I read here a question of Thea Stefanic. Could you please tell us if there are recordings of this repertoire? Are there recordings of this?
Okay. There are no records of these works. For the trio sonatas, there are a few recordings of Tartini trios. I have with me one second. I have with me Tactus record and a noted article for the Farnese Academy in the series Grande Barocco Italiano, titled Sette sonate per flauto, oboe, fagotto e cembalo. I think it is not a very reliable version, as Tartini never wrote for these instruments. And there is a list of Tartini recordings made by Federico Gon in the site Discover Tartini.
So there is maybe 1 minute left for a final question or final remark, or I try myself. Okay. Maybe it was very interesting about these unison or octave passages because, you know, there was a fashion in Venetian instrumental music about unison passages. It comes from the opera, and then it's still an open issue concerning how to accompany at the harpsichord or the organ such passages. And if we depart from the idea that we have still a trio sonata with harpsichord, then is a major issue of performance praxis, how to accompany such unisono passages. Just a remark from previous work of mine. Many thanks.
May I?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I wanted to tell Mariano that there is this reference of in the documents. I don't remember if it is the Academy in Padua, or a concert or a series of concerts that Tartini gave together with Vandini and Bissoli, the hoboist at Il Santo. And there, evidently, there were three. And they were paid, there are documents about being paid for, being three people at these occasions. I don't have my notes with me, but it is something which is known. It's not much, but it is a possibility that that some of that music was actually manufactured for this trio, very, very special trio.
Maybe I haven't an opinion for this, but thank you. I have to study the subject. I don't know this manuscript.
So many thanks for this remark to Dr. Durante. I now come to the last speaker of this session. Ana Lombardia is assistant professor of musicology at the University of Salamanca in Spain. Her PhD dissertation, Violin Music in Mid-18th Century Madrid, Context, Genres, Style, received special award and international diploma. She also holds a master in Hispanic music and a bachelor in violin. She has been a research fellow, sorry, I tried to read your biography, I'm not sure. She has been a research fellow at the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies Villa Tatti in Florence, at the Fondazione Chini in Venice, and at the Royal Spanish Academy in Rome, and at the Istituto Complutense de Ciencias Musicales in Madrid. She is a specialist in instrumental music from the long 18th century, paying particular attention to Spain and its international relations, especially with Italy, France, and Latin America. She has been awarded 2 international musicological prizes, the Francesco Ruspoli and the Otto Mayer Serra Prize of the University of California. Sure, now the presentation is on the reception of Tartini's violin sonatas in Madrid. Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much to the scientific committee for having accepted this paper. To date, Spain has been virtually neglected in Tartini's studies. However, a number of sources show that his accompanied violin sonatas were known, praised, and imitated in Madrid during the second half of the 18th century. This paper explores these issues for the first time. It is divided into 3 parts. Firstly, I will provide an overview of the violin sonata in mid-18th century Madrid. Secondly, I will comment on 5 different musical and documentary sources that are revealing about Tartini's impact in the city. Thirdly, I will focus on the stylistic similarities between his sonatas and the local output. During the mid-18th century, the sonata was the most fashionable violin music genre in Madrid. It was the favorite vehicle for virtuoso violinists to show off their technical and compositional prowess, serving as a letter of presentation to attract patrons or to secure a job. Between 1740 and 1776, a minimum of 165 accompanied violin sonatas were composed in Madrid and nearby cities such as Toledo. Only 62 of them have been located in musical sources so far. These are modest figures in comparison to other cities, but undoubtedly reflect the genre's popularity. Roughly half of the composers of the extant sonatas were Spanish, as highlighted with an asterisk. One of them was Francisco Manalt, who published the first set of violin sonatas ever printed in Spain in 1757. Another example is José Errando, author of the earliest extended violin method in Spanish. The other half of the composers were mainly Italian virtuosos such as Mauro Dallai from Parma, Francesco Montali from Naples, and Cristiano Reynaldi, who was the son of a Milanese violinist. The extant 62 sonatas reflect a wide variety of formal patterns, but most of them match the formal features that Daniel Hartz associates with the gallant style violin sonata. In other words, the main compositional models for Madrid-based composers were not early 18th century collections, such as Corelli's Opus 5, but instead more modern collections such as Locatelli's and Tartini's. This comes as no surprise, bearing in mind that their sonatas were known to some extent in Madrid, as will be shown in the case of Tartini. The following features stand out in the Madrilenian corpus. Most sonatas are grouped in collections of 6 or 12 works, and each sonata contains 3 or 4 movements. 2 combinations of movement types predominate: slow, main fast, and light fast, or else main fast, slow, and light fast. In 4 movement sonatas, an extra slow movement is usually added in the beginning. The main fast movements are usually the centerpiece of the composition, featuring a higher degree of formal and technical complexity than the other movements. Slow movements feature a freer structure. They are usually cantabile and may contain written out ornamentation. The widest variety of types is found in the last movements. Some sonatas feature a light dance-like ending, such as a minuet or a pastoral, and in other cases, a weightier movement is found, for example, a fugue or a multi-sectional structure. Most movements feature a binary form, including the simple binary, the rounded binary, and different types of sonata forms. Generally, the violin part contains a wide variety of motifs and ornaments, while the bass has a secondary role. The music is fluid and ornamental, comparable to the Rococo style in the visual arts of the period. Despite the integration of this music into pan-European trends, some features are particular to Spain. The bass is rarely figured, but most often consists of a simple melodic line. Judging from various sources, the choice of accompanying instrument was flexible, depending on the performance context, the instruments available, and the musicians who took part in each case. In chamber contexts, the most common accompanying instrument was the cello, called violin in Spain. In the 1740s and 50s, this practice was also usual in the Prussian court, where Tartini sent sonatas with a bassetto accompaniment, as he put it. The title of Manalt's collection is revealing in this sense. It contains 2 keywords: the camera, meaning da camera or chamber sonatas, and bajo solo, meaning solo bass or melodic bass, that is, for cello. Significantly, an advertisement of the violin method by Errando mentions 200 copies available in a single shop. Moreover, this method's title makes reference both to amateur and professional musicians. All this strongly suggests that violin playing was very much in fashion among high and middle class amateurs in Madrid. Various musical and documentary sources show that violin sonatas by Italian composers reached Madrid rapidly. Examples include Corelli's Opus 5, Veracini's Opus 1, and Locatelli's Opus 8. As for Tartini, there is evidence that some of his sonatas reached Madrid before his death in 1770 or shortly afterwards. To date, 4 sonatas have been located in manuscript copies related to the Spanish capital. They contain sonatas that were first published in Paris as part of Opuses 1, 2, 4, and 9. These sources are virtually unknown outside Spain, for they do not appear in Rhythm or in the recent thematic catalogue by Viverit and Olivari. Moreover, documentary evidence strongly suggests that other sonatas by Tartini could have reached Madrid before 1800. Next, I will comment briefly on 5 different groups of documentary and musical sources. The inventory and valuation of the 12th Duke of Alba's music library, the manuscript anthology titled 26 Sonatas de varios autores, 3 musical manuscripts preserved at Madrid Conservatoire, several texts published in the local press in the 1790s, and the earliest so-called history of Spanish music. The 12th Duke of Alba was one of the most powerful noblemen in the court of King Ferdinand VI. In the late 1740s, he was ambassador of Spain to France, and in 1750 he was appointed state secretary, so he returned to Madrid. He was an amateur violinist and violist, as well as an eager collector of chamber music. The inventory and valuation of his library mentions over 1,000 chamber works. This includes 4 or 5 books of sonatas by Tartini, amounting to 46 allegedly different violin sonatas. A second copy was made, most likely for the accompanist to play on the cello. One of the earliest located Spanish sources with compositions by Tartini is a manuscript copy of Sonata B10, first published as Opus 4 number 3. Interestingly, the last sonata in the same collection, published in Paris, has been attributed to Mauro Dalai, who was active in Madrid at that time and whose style bears some similarity with Tartini's. Unlike the Paris edition, in the Spanish copy, the bass is unfigured, probably due to local performance practice. This copy of Tartini's sonata is part of the manuscript anthology titled 26 Sonatas de varios autores, meaning 26 sonatas by different composers. This is a personalized compilation produced in a professional workshop upon order, judging from the neatness of the copy and from the table of contents that appears on page 1, including the names of the composers, the number of sonatas, and their prices. 8 composers are mentioned. Half of them lived and worked in Madrid, as highlighted with an asterisk. For example, Matías Boschoff and José Errando. The other 4 composers were active in the current territories of Italy, including Stefano Candeloro Arena from Messina, Giuseppe Tartini, Carlo Zuccari, alias Zuccherino or Zuccarini, and Juan Bautista Costa Parmigiano, that is Giovanni Battista Costa from Parma. Regarding prices, most sonatas cost 6 reales, except for the ones by Tartini and Ledesma, sold for 8 reales each, as highlighted in red. Judging from several advertisements of instrumental music copies in Madrid's press, 4 complementary reasons can be hypothesized for the higher prices. First, the number of pages of each work. Tartini's sonata is 6 pages long, whereas most of the sonatas in the volume are 4 pages long. Secondly, the technical difficulty, which is directly related to the time needed for the copy. Thirdly, novelty. Possibly, the violin sonatas by Tartini and Ledesma were the newest ones available in the shop. And fourthly, fame. By 1770, Ledesma was well known as viola player of Madrid's Royal Chapel, and shortly later, Tartini was praised in different Madrileñan texts, as will be shown. 3 other 18th century manuscripts containing Tartini sonatas survive in Madrid's conservatoire. In the late 18th century, they belonged to 2 different violinists of Madrid's Royal Chapel, namely Domingo Rodil and Bonifacio Zlotek. The latter came from Warsaw, so he was sometimes called Polako, meaning Polish. The surnames, initials, or nicknames of these 2 musicians appear in different places in the manuscripts, as you can see in the title page of the first sonata. Based on the owner's activity period in Madrid's Royal Chapel, these copies could have been used between 1763 and 96. Interestingly, in the 1770s, both Rodil and Zlotek took part in the musical gatherings held at Prince Charles' Royal Chamber. This prince, who would become King Charles IV shortly afterwards, was an eager music collector and violin player who owned a wide variety of chamber music for strings. So it seems likely that Tartini's music was performed in that context. In each of the 3 sonatas, the copist is different, as comparison of the G clefs and the capital A letters shows. An Italian origin has been suggested for these copies. It could be the case with the first manuscript, considering that the orthography of Italian words is correct and that the base contains figures, which is relatively unusual in the Madrid copies. In fact, the 2 other copies in this same group have no figures in the base part. Here we can see the title page of the second sonata, which has been identified as Brainerd S1. And this is the inside with no figures on the base and by a different copist. This is the title page of the third manuscript. An orthographical detail points at a Spanish origin. The copist wrote de el signor Tartini instead of del or di il in Italian. Inside the manuscript on folio 2, we can see that the title of the Allegro was modified into Fuga. In Madrid, movements featuring fugato writing were usually called in this way, So this change seems to be an adaptation to the Spanish context. It is worth noting that all 3 violin sonatas in this group are 3-movement sonatas featuring the formal pattern slow, main fast, and light fast. This was precisely the most usual pattern in the Madrid sonatas, the ones composed in Madrid. In contrast, the Tartini work copied in the manuscript anthology features a 4-movement pattern that was rarely used by local composers after 1750. Focusing on dates, it is striking that some of these copies were still being used in Madrid up until 60 years after their first editions of the sonata, I mean. This is not to say that the repertoire available in the city was obsolete. On the contrary, the local press attests to the rapid arrival of novelties from abroad. This apparently delayed interest in Tartini's sonatas can be rather interpreted as a symptom that he was already being canonized as a model for violin music composition in Spain. That also happened with Corelli, whose collection Opus 5 had a Madrid edition as late as 1772. The local press confirms that by 1790, Tartini was well known and admired in Madrid. He is mentioned in several commercial advertisements and short essays published in 2 local newspapers, the Diario de Madrid and the Gaceta de Madrid. An anonymous critic stated, I quote from the translation, "I have heard saying that the adagios by Tartini, the andantes by San Martino, and the allegros by Locatelli are very appropriate for overtures." End of quote. 6 years later, another anonymous writer ironically commented that Tartini's harmony treatise was one of the many rare animals that Spanish allegedly learned people ignored. This was a way to recommend studying Tartini's theoretical works, probably Trattato di musica secondo la vera scienza dell'armonia. In 1797, the 50 variations of L'arte dell'arco were for sale in 2 different Madrid bookshops, advertised both for violin and flute. Most likely, they were copies of the edition by Luigi Marescalchi, which contains 50 variations. Moreover, Marescalchi had lived in Madrid a few decades earlier. Notably, the earliest known history of Spanish music by José Teixidor mentions Tartini's school as a symbol of excellence in violin playing. More specifically, the author states that Tartini had taught one of the most outstanding violinist composers in mid-18th century Madrid, Cristiano Reynaldi. So far, no documentation confirming this has been located. Cristiano Reynaldi, born in Krakow, according to artist Pierleone Ghezzi, was in Rome in the 1740s. Ghezzi sketched this portrait and wrote underneath that Reynaldi was an excellent violin player who was in the service of a Spanish captain and played at Ghezzi's Chamber Music Academia in his own home. From 1750 until his death in 1767, Reynaldi worked in Madrid and nearby cities as chamber musician of the widowed Queen Elisabetta Farnese, who sponsored the publication of his sonatas Opus 1 in 1761. This collection is representative of the compositional trends that were in fashion in Madrid. The predominant pattern of movement types is, again, slow, main fast, and light fast. A critical edition of these sonatas was published last year, and there is a project for a recording. In sum, the evidence just discussed shows that Tartini's accompanied violin sonatas reached Madrid in his lifetime and remained in fashion for several decades. Up to 6 years after the first editions in Paris and Amsterdam, his sonatas constituted one of the main models for composition in this genre in Madrid. Moreover, a process of canonization of Tartini's compositions, theoretical works, and violin school is detected in Madrid in the 1790s and the 1800s. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So many thanks for this very interesting contribution. I have maybe a first question just connected with the previous paper. So you show us how important is the manuscript culture at this time still, and despite we have these Parisian and Amsterdam editions. So do we have any chance or any possibility to have the information about original figure base? Because we know, for example, from Vivaldi that when we have some editions of music in Amsterdam, this is not the original figure base, but this is just edited by the editor. Mm-hmm. What's your position on this matter, or do you have any evidence from archival sources?
I'm not sure if I understand your question. Are you asking if in Madrid the other option?
For example, in one slide of yours, there was an edition, and then you had a copy in Madrid without a figure. Mm-hmm. The bus was unfigured.
Okay, I interpret this as an adaptation to the local context, because we have very scarce sources that comment on how this music was performed. But in most manuscripts and in the rules of the Royal Chapel's exams, they mention the cello as the accompanying instrument. However, in the Duke of Alva's house, he owned several instruments, including a fortepiano, not a cembalo, a fortepiano, which was the newest keyboard instrument. So we can speculate that in that chamber context, they could have used keyboard instruments as well. But at the time of copying, it was not usual to add figures. There is another reason, which is that harmony is normally very simple in the sonatas by Madrid-based composers. So an accompanist who was trained in adding the chords would not need the figures.
On the other hand, you told us this was music for professional musicians, but also for amateurs. And for example, in many Parisian editions, we find figure-based too. But at least, as you show us, not in the manuscript culture.
Yeah, both options are found in Madrid. For example, the sonatas by Francesco Montali, who mm-hmm. was from Naples but spent 30 years in Toledo. All his located sonatas have a figured base. It depends. The predominant thing in Madrid is not to include figures, but this is not to say that keyboard instruments were not used occasionally.
So look at the chat. Are there any questions?
May I? Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was very, very interesting. Can you please tell more about ways in which those manuscripts came to Spain? Are there only individual musicians that imported the manuscript? For me, it's very interesting, for example, that Stratico's only edition of his Sei Sonate is preserved in Madrid. So it's certainly the same. Stratico, Giuseppe Michele Stratico is Tartini's pupil. Yeah. It's the only edition of his works, and it's preserved only in Madrid. So it's
well, Madrid was updated as regards instrumental music, especially from 1750 onwards. We have a higher number of documentary sources from 1770 onwards, because that's when more music is advertised in the local press and so on. But in the previous 2/3 of the century, there is evidence that very recent music reached Madrid. Corelli's Opus 5 is copied in a manuscript in 1709, 9 years after the first edition. Vivaldi also reached Madrid 10 years after the first editions. And there were various ways for music to arrive. On the one hand, bookshops that sold music, because there were not music shops with this name, but some bookshops imported music from other European cities and sent Spanish music there. And on the other hand, private collectors and individual musicians traveled as well. So the Duke of Alba was ambassador to Paris, to France, and brought music from Paris. This Bonifacio Zlotek, who owned the manuscript with Tartines sonatas, he traveled to Warsaw 1 or 2 times while he was in Madrid. The Italian composers like Montali, Reynaldi, they also went out of Spain occasionally. So all these fostered the circulation of music.
Yes, maybe music fairs or something in even maybe not in Italy, but in Central Europe.
Music fairs.
Fair. Like trade places.
There were webs of
yes,
but this is documented in Madrid mainly from 1770 onwards.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So,
sorry, Robert, if I may add something, maybe Sergio will help me also. I know in one of Tartini's letters, he speaks about a student from Spain, someone connected to a Spanish ambassador or something like that.
Really? So that could be Reynaldi.
Yeah, I would have to check. I forgot in which letter, but I would have to check. But I remember he speaks of a student of his that's some way connected to like a servant and something like that to a Spanish attaché or ambassador or something like that. So this may also be a way how Tartini's music came to Spain, right?
Yeah, I would be very grateful to know more about that. I have not said that the earliest history of music has many errors, so we cannot trust it. In fact, he mentions José Manalt, mixing the names of José Errando and Francisco Manalt. So it's not a very good source. We have to check others as well.
Okay. I'll try and find it.
Thanks.
So I checked the time. Are there last questions?
Yes, please. Thank you, Hannah, for your relations. Very, very interesting. I have just a question about which sonatas in the musical sources in Madrid that you present. If you have seen the sources, if they are more the printed sonatas or not really. It's prevalence of the sonatas which were in the edit music of by Tartini or not. If have you the possibility to check it?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
So no, in this.
Italian, if you like.
Sorry.
You can speak Italian if you like.
Ah, okay, that's better for me. No, which sonatas, quali se erano prevalenti le sonate edite di Tartini o le sonate genericamente anche inedite? Se le hanno copiate in queste fonti, se c'erano le sonate, quelle che erano state pubblicate o no, o indipendenti?
Solamente sono state trovate queste 4 sonate in copie manoscritte che coincidono con 4 che sono state pubblicate fuori, ad Amsterdam e da Parigi. Però non ci sono dati su altre sonate a Madrid, non dati specifici, solo sonate del Tartini e basta.
Ah, ok, quindi quelle erano le uniche sonate, was the unique sonatas.
Queste 4 sono le uniche
sì.
trovate in fonti musicali spagnole.
Ah, ok, ok. Non avevo capito. Thank you.
Di niente.
Grazie.
So many thanks to all the speakers in this very interesting section. I think we have now the break before the next keynote.